Alrighty, folks, we're going to take a look at 3.5. We're going to write ratios and proportions. Then you're going to do a Schoology assignment to practice. So a ratio is just going to be a comparison. And it's a comparison that uses division or a fraction bar, as you'll see. Whereas, so that's just a plain ratio. That's going to be, it's going to look like one fraction. Whereas a proportion is going to be a comparison of two ratios. So a proportion is a comparison of two ratios. So for example, if I had a ratio of like 3 to 4, you would read that as 3 to 4. You're comparing 3 to 4. Then a proportion would have to look like 3/4 is equal to, let's say I doubled the 3 and doubled the 8. So it's comparing those two ratios. So a ratio is just going to look like one fraction, and then you're going to manage it from there. And then proportion is going to look like two fractions, and we're going to work with two at a time. So a ratio uses division to compare two quantities. That's what I was talking about up there. But it also can be written a couple of different ways. So the ratio of two quantities, A and B, where B is not equal to 0, and this is only because you can't divide by 0, so don't worry too much about this part, can be written in three ways. You would say A to B, so a ratio of A to B. So say, for example, you're looking at your class list and you say, oh, in terms of boys to girls, how many kids do I have? Boys to girls. And so you might say, okay, the ratio of boys to girls. And then you would say, well, my ratio of boys to girls, I might have 20 boys and only 15 girls. So I would say my ratio is 20 to 15. Another way you can write it is like this. That means the same thing. So I could write my boy to girl ratio as 20 to 15. So those are two different ways. And then a third way would be to go ahead and write it as a fraction, A to B. So whatever comes first here has to be first here and on the top here. And that would be the same kind of thinking. So I could also put boys to girls and have that equal 20 to 15. So these three different ways are all just different ways to say the same thing, but they're all just different formats for writing ratios. Each ratio is read the ratio of A to B. So pay attention when you're doing these to what came first and what came second, because that's going to be important when you go to write them in these three forms, that you put them in the proper order. So pay attention to that part. Now it says ratios should be written in what we call the simplest form, or you might call it reduced. And so you've done this before, because since we're representing them as a fraction, you would have to write them in lowest terms. That might be something that you think of or know about, lowest terms. So whichever those terms makes the most sense to you. So for example, over here, this one's not in lowest terms because 5 goes into 20 4 times and 5 goes into 15 3 times. So the simple form would be 4 to 30. Same thing here. 5 goes into 20 4 times and into 15 3. So I would read that as 4 to 3, but it would be written as a ratio or with a colon rather than as a fraction. And then same thing up here, I would write it as 4 to 3. So you want it in lowest terms, kind of reduced fraction, simplified form, whatever term makes the most sense to you. So what does that look like? Cell phone use. A person makes 6 long distance calls and 15 local. So that's going to be our two things, long distance calls and local calls. Okay, it says find a ratio. Now pay attention to what's first. Long distance to local. So that means that this is going to be like your A and this is going to be like your B. So to long distance to local, I look up here and I have 6 long distance and 15 local, but what goes into both of those? 3. 2 times into 6, 5 times into 15. So I would write my ratio as 2 to 5. You wouldn't read that as 2/5. You would read it as 2 to 5, or it could be written as the ratio of 2 to 5, or you could write it as 2 to 5. Those are those three different ways of writing it. Any of those three simplified versions. How about if it asks me to write long distance? This one says to do long distance to all calls. Well, okay, all calls is different. That means that we're going to have to look at the total. And so if we have 6 that were long distance plus 15 that were local, that total is 21. So when I look at my long distance calls, that's a 6. When I look at my total, that's a 21. And again, 3 goes into both of those. So it goes into 6 2 times, it goes into 21 7 times. So my ratio is 2 to 7, or I could write it as 2 to 7, or I could write it as 2 to 7. All right, so let's see, how does this look? Sean and Myra are selling tickets to their school's talent show. Sean sold 36 tickets and Myra sold 44 tickets. Okay, find the specified ratio. So pay attention to what it asks. Here it says the number that Sean sold, okay, that's a 36, looking up above, to the number that Myra sold, looking up above, that's a 44. So the 2 is right there. That makes this like my A and this like my B. So I would write it as 36 to 44. The most common way is definitely writing it like a fraction. Now, if I write it as 36 to 44, or 36 to 44, it doesn't matter. I still need to simplify it. So let's think about what number goes into both of those. 4 goes into both of those, and you might have to do a little thinking depending on kind of how good you are at mental math. But what'll happen is 4 goes into 36 9 times, and 4 goes into 44 11 times. So you would have a 9 to 11 ratio, 9 to 11. So what that means is for every 9 tickets Sean sells, Myra sells 11. So it's just a comparison or a ratio. In the second one, it says the number of tickets Myra sold, so looking up here, that's 44, to the number of tickets Sean and Myra sold. So this is a total. So my total would be his tickets plus her tickets, which is going to turn out, when I add those together, to be 80. So if I'm going to compare her tickets to the total, I'm going to start at 44 divided by 80. You can probably tell by looking at that, even without your calculator, that 4 goes into both of those numbers. So 4 goes into 44 11 times, and it goes into 80 20 times. So my answer in simplified form, which I always have to use, is 11 to 20. You can write it like this, but most of the time we're just going to write it like a fraction format. So what if we get into proportions now, where there's just not one ratio? There's kind of 2 things you need to be able to do today. So the 2 skills that you'll need to be successful on your homework. 1, you need to be able to write and reduce a ratio. So that's 1 fraction like we've been practicing. The second thing is you need to be able to possibly write and then solve, meaning finding a value, a proportion. So that's going to be where they are combined and compared to each other. So we already did this skill. That's what we've been looking at in our first examples. Now we're going to look at that second one. Here we're going to solve the proportion. Okay, so let's think about what we already know about solving. Y over 15 equals 3 over 5. And that's our starting point, our proportion, which is comparing 2 ratios. So if we're trying to solve for y, given what we learned in chapter 3 earlier on, currently the y is divided by 15. So to undo division, we need to multiply that by 15. And whatever you do to one side, you do to the other. And keep in mind that a 15 is always over 1 because it's not a fraction. So any whole number is always over 1. On the left side, it cancels out. Over here, you'd get 3 times 15, which is 45. And on the bottom, 5 times 1 is 5, but that can be reduced or simplified because 5 goes into both. And so you would get 9 over 1, or simply 9. And then if you wanted to compare or check your answer, you would go back and you would say, here was my original proportion. What if I put that 9 in here? Now the way to check this, is to say, looking at a number pair you do have, I'm looking at the 5 because I always start with a small number. I had to multiply that by 3 to get 15. So the top number should be that I multiplied this 5 to get this 15. So I have to do the same on the top if I'm right, which would mean this 3 times 3 has to equal this value. So since I tripled this 5 to get the 15, I would need to triple this 3 to get the 9. And so looking at it, I feel comfortable that I did the right thing because those are actually equivalent proportions. So let's do the same thing here. And then this last one's really complex, and I'm not going to even worry about that one right now. So we'll cross that guy off, and let's take a look at this next set. Okay, so I'm going to draw my lines just so it looks like something I'm familiar with. This C is divided by 28, so I'm going to multiply it by 28 onto the other side. And then those numbers are getting pretty big, so go ahead and get your calculator out. You'd have C equals 28 times 9, which is giving me 252 over 4, because 9 times 28 was 252, but 4 times 1 is just 4. And if I take 252 and divide it by 4, I come up with the value of 63. And so that is the answer that would solve my proportion. Check my solution simply means I go back up here and I look, does 9 over 4 truly equal 63 over 28? So check the one that you knew before. Before I knew this one, so to get 4 to turn into 28, I multiplied it by 7. So then I check, if I take 9 and multiply it by 7, do I get 63? And the answer is yes, so I know it checks out. Looking over here next door, I'm going to say A was divided by 32, so to undo division, I'll need to multiply by 32. These cancel. So 7 times 32 on my calculator gives me 224 on the top. On the bottom, 8 times 1 gives me 8. And then again, just using my calculator to do that division, I get that A is 28. So if I go back to my original and I put the 28 in where the A was, I'm just going to check and see how I did. So I go to the one that was given to me originally. 8 times 4 would be 32. So does 7 times 4 equal 28? Yes, it does. So I know I made the right choice there. Okay. I think we're going to stop there because that will allow you to be successful at these 2 skills that you need for today. There is a Schoology assignment. So if you look for that little puzzle piece, it'll say Schoology assignment 3.5. And that'll give you a chance to practice these 2 things so you can be experts on that moving into tomorrow. A problem like this one will be easier to solve after we learn our kind of short